Hello, today we're going to draw a simple mountain landscape using atmospheric perspective. We'll be using two techniques that artists employ in atmospheric perspective. Overlapping, that's the technique where we give the illusion of depth in a drawing by placing objects in front of or behind other objects. And we'll also use atmospheric perspective. When we use atmospheric perspective, we draw so that the objects that are furthest away from us are somewhat blurry. It's hard to see the details of those objects. Let's begin. When we look at these two examples, we can see the difference between overlapping and atmospheric perspective. In this example with three smiley faces on it, you see that the object in front is the largest and it overlaps the smiley face behind it. That shows us that this largest smiley face is closest to us. It's closer than the smiley face that it is overlapping or covering. Likewise, the middle smiley face is overlapping, it's covering part of the smallest smiley face. That smallest smiley face is furthest away from us. In this example with the trees, you see atmospheric perspective. So these trees that are furthest in the distance seem to be a little bit blurry. There are atmospheric particles like fog or smoke in front of those trees that makes it hard to see the details. You can see they're also smaller. Whereas these trees in the foreground or up front are darker, they have more detail, and they're larger. So in this drawing, the artist is clearly showing the illusion of depth or distance in the forest. Here's another example that shows atmospheric perspective. There seems to be a fog, and these blobs that are furthest away from the artist are very blurry. They're dim, they're hard to see, they're light in color, where these that are closest are dark with a lot of detail. Now before we begin drawing, let's review the SketchBook Express application icons. Gallery, Add New Sketch, I for Information, Undo Arrow, Redo Arrow, Brush Editor, Draw Styles, Free Draw, Line Tool, Rectangle Tool, Circle Tool, Symmetry, Text, Transform, Layers. Step 1, outline a horizontal rectangle as your drawing space. So let's use the rectangle tool and pull out a horizontal rectangle for our forest. Step 2, sketch the outline of a mountain in the foreground. So this mountain is going to be the closest to us. I'm going to draw mine using Free Draw and make it appear to look like the mountain in the picture. Doesn't have to be exactly like it. Those lines need to touch though. My line didn't touch over here, so let me come back and make sure it does touch. Step 3, outline a second mountain behind the first. And step 4, add the third mountain in the distant space behind the other two. So in this illustration, we've used overlapping. This mountain is furthest away from us. It's overlapped by this mountain. It's in the middle ground. And in the foreground, we have this large mountain. It overlaps or covers up part of the second and the third. Now to give depth, we're going to use some shading. But first, let's use Fill Bucket. And we're going to use some varying scales of gray. First of all, the sky will be the lightest gray. Remember, what's furthest away from us is the lightest in color when we're talking about atmospheric perspective. I'm going to move down the rhombus and get a medium shade of gray for that next most distant mountain range. I'll move down the rhombus again for a darker shade of gray for the middle ground mountain. And for the mountain in the foreground, I'm going to use a very dark gray. Now this handout refers to different degrees of darkness in pencils with 2H, HB, etc. We don't have that, but we will be changing the opacity of our drawing tools to be able to do some squircles. Squircles are like loopy lines that artists can use to shade in and give some variety for our sky Let's go back up to a medium gray, come back to our pen tool. We'll increase the radius a little bit, but we'll decrease the opacity down to about 0.10, 0.11, 0.10. And then when we squircle, when we do lots of loops, it's designed to appear kind of like clouds in the sky, or if you want to think about the wind blowing. But this is just going to give some shading, some color, some interest, some variety, some depth to our drawing. And obviously, if you were drawing on paper and you did not have the fill bucket, you would use this technique to color in your entire drawing. Sometimes this is also called spaghetti coloring. Lots of overlapping looping circles. And when you've reduced the opacity like we did in SketchBook, each time you go over the same place, your layers of marks create a darker color. I'm just going to squircle back over everything so it doesn't look like my squircles were too routine in their pattern. Some squircles should be small, some should be large. As I said, they'll kind of work together to make it look like there are clouds in the sky. Now, our most distant mountain, we'll call it mountain number 3, needs to be darker than the sky. However, these two closer mountains need to be a good bit darker. Here's where we'll begin our graduation, the progression of values from light to dark, or from dark to light. So let's make our gray a little bit darker. We can leave our opacity low, and we can leave our radius where it is. And we'll start to squircle in the second mountain. Now these squircles can represent bushes or trees growing on the mountain. And the more you go over them, the darker they become. Now we can see from the handout, there's a lot of repeated squircling going on around the edges where the two mountains meet. And that's kind of creating some shadow where this mountain is being overlapped by the mountain in front of it. Likewise, we can do the same thing on the right side of our drawing. We can continue to squircle and color in there so that it appears that the middle mountain is creating more shadow in front of the third and most distant mountain. Now, for our second mountain, our middle ground, we're going to do some medium shading. We'll come down the rhombus and pick a slightly darker gray. And continue our squircling. Now this doesn't look that much darker than the gray we just had. But remember, this is graduation. It's when our color values move from lighter to darker, or darker to lighter. I'll try to make my squircles less even. That will make it appear a little more natural. Again, this is designed to represent bushes, organic shapes. So your squircle patterns should not be too routine. In other words, they shouldn't resemble a geometric pattern. They should be much more organic. And lastly, for my closest mountain, we need to add the darkest shading. So I'm going to come all the way down the rhombus to black and increase our opacity some. And add squircles to that mountain. Not quite black, it's pretty close to it. And then our final detail is to add some trees, some shadows, some bushes. In particular, we're going to focus on the closest two mountains. So let's just keep our drawing tools set up like they are, medium opacity, and we'll draw some straight lines up and then feather out on each side. These are supposed to be like pine trees, so they have kind of a triangular structure. That's why I start with a straight line and then fan out on either side. Start with a straight line, fan out. You can have any number of pine trees you want. A lot of times, even in the wintertime, when all of the trees on the mountain have lost their leaves, you can see a few pine trees still standing tall, kind of like in this picture that we're creating. And we'll put a couple of little pine trees on this mountain over here. Just around the top. You can add as many as you want, or as few. We're going to add a few more in slightly darker value color on this mountain. And again, these are just suggestions of trees. They just look a lot like triangles out there in the distance. There. That's what our finished drawing looks like. Simple atmospheric perspective. Again, the objects that are farthest in the distance look somewhat hazy, lighter in color, blurry. There's fog or clouds in between the artist and this most distant point. And the darker objects are closer. They have greater detail. Simple atmospheric perspective, utilizing the technique of overlapping. Again, your largest mountain is closest. It overlaps or covers part of the second mountain, which in turn covers part of the third mountain. Thanks for watching.